Okay, well, I think we're going to go with it and assume that everybody's here and that a few people might join us in a moment. Hello and welcome to this session about remodeling with data. I'm Anne Sorajani. I'm Chief Executive of the Audience Agency, the UK charity for cultural participation and audience engagement. And I'm really delighted to be one of the collaborators working on this fantastic Data Echo Culture Conference. And I'm also delighted to be doing a session here with my colleague, Sophia. It's very nice to be working with a colleague. I've had a few sessions already with panelists from all over the world, which has also been fascinating, of course, but it's very nice to be at home with Sophia. Sophia, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a moment, if that's okay, when we kick off. Meanwhile, I'm just going to say very quickly that we are recording this session. If you don't want to be recorded, please register in the chat. Can I also say my cat is sitting on my other notes, and I just need to move it out the way. Right, thank you. I hope you can see how to get the translation and captioning at the bottom of your screen. Any problems with that, again, can you let us know through the chat? I see Eric is looking after us all and making sure that everybody who needs everything is catered for. Do ask him. Now, please, this session is not a kind of panel session where we have some very wise people talking together among themselves. It's me and Sophia talking to you. So we would really, really like it if you talk to us. If you have questions or examples or frankly more interesting things to say, please put them in the chat. We will be responding. Okay, I'm going to just tell you a little bit, just to manage your expectations a little about this session. Do I have to say, seeing as we're not on the main stage and I'm in Zoom, I've allowed the cat into the room. It's not been in the room all the time. I do apologise. Okay, so this session, I'm just going to move the chat out of the way. Just want to stress that this really is an introduction to the use of data and business model canvas. If you're a business model canvas expert or a huge data expert, this session may not be of that much interest to you. If you're interested, however, on having a go at some of these things for the first time, this should be very interesting to you, or at least that is our intention. It's broadly designed for cultural and creative organisations, creative industry organisations, not the end of the world if you're not, but we've been thinking a lot about those kinds of examples. We've also been thinking this, we're more geared, although you can use business model canvas for whole organisations and so on, this is really, we've been really thinking about its use for a single product or kind of activity. We've thought quite a lot about the current challenges around developing a new business model for your digital work. So I'm sure many of you, wherever you are in the world, suddenly had to throw a lot of your work online and often did a lot of that for free, and now wondering what kind of a business model may sit behind it. So we have sort of thought about some of these things with that filter, but not exclusively. It does assume that we're thinking about niche products and offerings rather than kind of mass market offers. And I just want to stress that although as the audience agency, we are very interested in cultural democracy, inclusion, and other important social aspects of our work as cultural institutions, this particular session is about monetization. It's about being commercial. It's about when we need to generate revenue in order to enable us to do all the other things we do, including our social mission. So very much focused on commercialisation, or at least Sophia is, and I try to be, I think is the right way to think about it. So that's us. And I'm now going to hand over to Sophia to give us an outline of what the session is going to be about. And then we're going to do a bit of a double hander, talking to each other, hopefully not over each other for interpreters. And as I say, we really do encourage you, please chat with us in the chat. Okay, Sophia, over to you.
Great, thank you, Anne. I'm Sophia Woodley. I'm Head of Innovation Policy and Research for the Audience Agency. And in my job, I both look at policy, but also work with individual organizations to help them become more resilient and generate more revenue. So that's the experience that I'm going to be bringing to you today. We have already done our introduction. I'm going to do a short introduction to what the business model canvas is and what it's useful for. And then we're going to spend most of the session looking at 3 of the categories within the business model canvas. So we're going to talk about customer segments, the value proposition, and revenue streams. And if you don't quite know what that means yet, that's fine. We will explain it all to you because, as Anne said, this is an introductory session. And at the end, we will talk about pulling it all together and what questions you might ask to develop a business model canvas and what data you might want to use and find to be able to do that. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
So to start off with, what is the business model canvas? I hope you can all see that. Basically, this was not developed by us. It was developed by Alexander Osterwalder about 15 years ago, and he's written a lot about it. So there's more information you can find if you're interested. But basically, no, it's all right. We can look at the, we can look at the.
Go back.
Basically, it's a way to look at, on one piece of paper, the whole picture of a particular project or a product that you're developing as a starting point or as a summary, so that you can see, here are all the activities I do. Here are all of the customers. Here are all the costs and revenues. All on one page makes up your business model. So it's not the final answer. You won't be able to fit every insight and bit of information that you have onto it. That's not what it's for. It's not a business plan, but it is a very good way of starting out thinking about a new product or service, or maybe looking at something you do already with the eye to change it or understand it better. So it's a good exercise. I use it with organizations in workshops, so you can do a quick version of this in an hour, you know, if you're really snappy. But to do it with a group of people from an organization, which is the best way to do it, it's better to do it in around a day in a workshop, or you can work through it yourself.
Forward.
Yes. Can somebody let me know if they are seeing Anne's screen share, because somebody has said they're not able to see it, and I want to make sure that we're sharing the right thing.
Yes, please.
Because I can see it. Good. Thank you, Lauren. Brilliant. Just checking. So our focus today is going to be, the business model canvas has two sides. There's a left-hand side, which is focused on how you deliver a product or a project, which is what resources does it take, how much does it cost, what partners do you need, all of that. Then the right hand of the side of the canvas is what we're going to focus on today, which is, you can see here, customer segments, customer relationships, channels, revenue streams. It's about your users or the people who you're selling to. And we're also going to talk about the heart of the canvas, which is the value proposition. And again, we will explain in more detail as we go through what each of those are. But we're going to start out with customer segments. Brilliant. Next slide.
I didn't mean to move you on to customer segments quite as scarily as that, Sophia. My apologies.
That's all right.
We are ready to click. Sorry. Okay. So we always start by looking at customer segments, or another way of saying it is we always start by looking at the user or the person who is the one that actually benefits from your product, and move our way through the canvas from there. This is because this is the foundation of what you do. So you always start out by asking yourself, who are we creating value for? Who are we benefiting from what we do? Who are our important users? Those questions. And then once you, and what do we know about them? And what do we want to know about them? What are their needs? What are their characteristics? How do they want to engage? Anne will talk through in much greater detail why we want to know this, but this is basically the foundation of user-centered design. Sometimes it's called service design, always starting from the person rather than from what you want to sell them. That's the best way of making sure that their needs are met. Now, it's called a customer segment in the business model canvas.
Sometimes people talk about users. We often talk about audiences. But it's important to understand that when you're doing a business model canvas, it might not just be about your audience members. So they are people that you create value for and sell things to, if you're a theater or an orchestra or whatever. But you also do that for other people. So people that come to your cafe, visitors, could be, customers. But your customers might be other arts organizations. If you hire a desk in your office, then your customer might be another organization. And you can even think of funders as customers of yours. A funder gives you money in exchange for a certain outcome, possibly a social benefit. So keep in mind when you're thinking about how to generate money, that you're actually creating value for a lot of different groups, and all of those can be thought of as customers in the sense of a business model canvas. Next slide.
That come up for you?
Yes, thank you. So in thinking more about what are your customer segments, who are your users, one way, and this is Alexander Osterwalder's way, Anne has a slightly different way, which she will explain. How do you determine what the customer segment is? And the answer is, it is segmented based on the other parts of the canvas. So different segments will need or value something different. So they will have different answers to the value proposition. They might require you to have a different sort of relationship with them. Your relationship with a funder is different than your relationship with somebody who comes to a community program, is different to your relationship to your biggest fan who has a subscription and comes to every event and gives you $10,000 a year. Segments also have different willingness to pay, so that affects the revenue stream. They might be reached through different channels. And so one way of thinking about how to identify particular groups of your users is thinking about how they fit in different ways into the business model canvas. Next slide. So segmentation, this is another take on how segmentation works from McDonald and Dunbar. Segmentation is the process of splitting customers or potential customers into different groups within which customers have the same or similar requirements. So again, that's saying they might all have the same needs. They might all need to be communicated through the same channels. This particular definition is from somebody talking about it from the point of view of marketing. And that is part of what we're looking at, but we are looking at the big picture in segmentation terms. Next slide. And I think this is where Anne takes over from me again.
Yeah, that's right, Sophia. And I was just thinking about, we had a bit of an argument earlier on about what the starting point for segmentation actually is. And then I thought about it after and thought, segmentation is an incredibly useful way of organizing any kind of information for any kind of job. Let's be absolutely honest about it. I think that, bearing in mind when you said that important thing that a business model canvas exercise can be done in a day, and actually ideally you want to do it quickly and perhaps work on it and come back to it. So it's not an exhaustive exercise. It's not perhaps like the segmentation you might have that your organization runs on day to day and the whole organization understands what's going on. It may relate to it or it may not. So you can use segmentation models for kind of light, quick jobs and then move on, or there may be something that stays with you for a very long time. So I think that's right to think about it in that way. And as you say, because we're focusing on the use of segmentation, particularly thinking about the business model canvas, we need to think about it from that perspective. I'm quite used to talking about segmentation, so I don't want to overcomplicate it, and we tried to streamline it a bit anyway. This is an important observation, however, in this image. I don't know how well you can read it. The whole point about business model canvas, to some extent, and also generally about customer-centric design is that it does take us away from the old models that many cultural institutions are used to, which is to say, here's my product, it is untouchable, and now I'm just going to go out and find who on earth I could flog it to persuade into it, drag screaming, whatever. But the idea that actually you start with a product and then find a market for it, it does challenge that idea. It is much more about thinking about customer needs and planning for those accordingly. Now that might, it may still be that you've got Vivaldi's Four Seasons as your core product, but there's lots of other things around it that impact the experience that are much more, that we need to be open to how we might design different experiences for different kinds of users. And certainly when we're thinking about entirely new ways of generating revenue. So I just wanted to make that point, have a little read of that. We will leave you with these slides to muse over. There's quite a lot of tools and techniques that we will only have time to skate over. So I'll just give you a chance to have a little look at that in your own time. But essentially, the shift away from product first, audience second, to audience-centric, customer-centric way of thinking about what we do and understanding our customers' needs as the inspiration for what we do next. So we do have tons of information about our audiences. In fact, we are completely surrounded by it. It just so happens I've got lots of things from the audience agency there, but actually, of course, it's everywhere. There are endless reports that are created by the people. Every organisation invests in some small way, fit to its scale, in data, whether they know they do or not. So actually, it seems to me that the issue is not about having data or the access to data. It is much more about what we actually then do with it. So when we think a little bit about user insights, have I got the right? That's not entirely what I thought I was going to be looking at next, but never mind. We are surrounded by all sorts of data in all kinds of information. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a breakdown, a useful way of thinking about what kinds of data you may have access to. If you're a very large organisation with lots of people running around doing data, you'll have lots of this. If you're a small organisation, there may be some of these things that you haven't even thought that you could get your hands on, but sometimes there is data everywhere if you know where to look, and importantly, if you're thinking about what to do with it. So let's have a look. So we quite often skip over anecdotal information, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that anecdote is actually a really useful source of data. Anecdotes really give us clues and ideas. They give us they're the smoke of the fire that says there's something really interesting that you need to know about here. Let's go and find out what's going on. The only thing about anecdotes is they're not entirely reliable. What one person says may be maybe totally eccentric, it's a total outlier thing, or it may be indicative of a whole group of people that think something. So anecdotal data tends to need to be validated in some way. An example of this one is always, intel from front of house. If you are an organisation that has a front of house area, there'll be people, whether they're invigilators or, box office staff, or people who are the welcoming staff or sales staff on a front desk and so on. That intel that they collect all day, every day is probably very, very valuable indeed. And they will have extremely good grasp and understanding, perhaps, of your customer segments, and often a very, very good place to start with getting some of the anecdotal information you need. And my bugbear is the taxi driver in the back of the cab, which one of my very first jobs, and my artistic director at the time would come in every day and tell me what his latest taxi driver had told him the thing to do was, and it used to drive me mad. And now I think actually the taxi driver intelligence is actually very important, and again can give you lots of clues as to particularly what non-attenders think about what's going on. So that kind of anecdotal information, it comes from somewhere. Of course, it doesn't tell you what everybody thinks, but it gives you useful clues and helps you to frame useful questions. So that is a data source in itself. Then let's think about, as I say, there is a vast amount of stuff. There is a whole industry, we're part of it, that earns its living by providing useful information about audiences, useful information about the cultural sector, organising it, reorganising it, whole shed loads of academics. There is lots and lots of data out there. So this is all secondary data and desk research. What we can find out from other studies, data sets, publicly available information. And I will tell you that in the course of, I think we work with something like about 400 organisations. Commission us to do research and things research and related, ask questions about audience every year. And nearly always people come to us, first of all, asking a question that somebody else down the road with a very similar questions already answered. So sometimes a little bit of digging can get you an awful lot of the answers you actually need yourself. So examples of that might be, there's the publicly available information like census data. Lots of people through this conference talking about the value of benchmarks. Here's what the average is. How do we compare to it? Super useful way of contextualizing a small amount of data that you may have. Sector surveys, what other organisations know about their audiences, and they may be willing to share it with you. You know, we are fortunately a reasonably collaborative industry, and people are often very willing to share. So all sorts of ways of accessing other kinds of information. Do that first before you then go and spend lots of money on trying to organise your own data or do your own research. What I always think of as big-ish data, some of the data we have access to is notionally big data. It's not always as big as we might like it to be, but I always think of it as being byproduct data as well. So powerful if you can capture and analyse it without getting lost. In other words, you can find the algorithm. Can just be useful to give us clues. So again, when I'm talking about this, about a byproduct data, I suppose the classic ones that we're often have access to might be ticketing data, social media data, web stats, often mediated by somebody who has a tool that can do useful things with them, but sometimes we're just dealing with that raw material. Again, proper analysis of that data can of course help us to do segmentation in itself, can help us to answer big questions, but it can just be a really useful way of formulating the right question. Because finally we come on to the gold standard, primary research, in other words, research direct with our customers, where we talk to them directly and we get data directly from them, often perhaps feedback on something that we're doing, whether that's in numbers or just qualitative feedback. But it's worth bearing in mind that getting that kind of data is enormously expensive, well, not enormously expensive, it's more expensive than the other stuff, which is lying around free. It takes up a lot of time, even if it doesn't take money. It's time consuming. It's expensive, but it's focused. And really what you're trying to do with primary data is to fill in the gaps that cannot be filled with any of this other information. Validating what you think you might know, exploring clues that you found in other data sources. The primary research is the bit that fills the gaps and perhaps fills the whole picture and really gives you the confidence to take risks and move on and do new things. Lots of info download there. Sophia, would you agree with that? My quick, anything else you can add to all of that? So far, so good.
Just to say, don't be frightened by the idea of secondary research and think it all has to be academic or it all has to be big and weighty and meaningful and difficult. A lot of the secondary research that I do as someone who works in this is typing things like, how many people under 20 use Facebook into Google and seeing what happens. It could be just looking up prices that other organizations in your area charge to hire a room. It can be simple. It can take only a few minutes as long as you know what you want to find out. Or it can take years.
It can take years. I was going to say there's a whole other seminar in here that we won't try and pick off today. But actually, in a way, the data is always there. The real skill that I think we need in cultural organisations these days is knowing what questions to ask. It's nailing the right question that feels really challenging. If you get the question right, it's remarkable actually how easy it is to go and find the data that you might need there. So sometimes they are questions beyond the data, but often you can get something indicative enough to get you to the next point, particularly for an exercise like Business Model Canvas. So moving on, oh look, Lauren, well done. Somebody is communicating with us. Yeah, knowing what the deal questions to ask is definitely the hardest part. And I think that's really worth, if that is something you're struggling with, I think that's a place sometimes where groupthink can really help. It's worth sometimes just sitting down with your colleagues, whether you're using a business model canvas exercise as a way of doing it, or whether it's just a question of saying, we need to understand, our audience development plan or whatever else it is that you're working on. Sometimes just group thinking what the killer questions are, what we don't know, is actually a really, really useful way to get there. But yes,
I will say it is hard to do a business model canvas by yourself. Theoretically, you can do it, but it is much, much easier to do it in a big group where you can throw out ideas, argue about stuff, put stuff on Post-it notes, and treat it as a work in progress. It's almost an outline for your future research and your questions. Absolutely, and I think
Sophia, you alluded very briefly to the fact that there is a link between business model canvas and the design thinking generation. And one of the first rules of design thinking is diversity of thoughts, diversity of ideas is the kind of critical key to this whole design thinking model. So yeah, thank you though, Lauren. We feel we share the pain. Okay, so moving forward. So exactly, we've got a lot of data. Is it the right stuff? I mean, one of the great things about segmentation is it does really help us. We are bombarded with information. How do we make it useful? And how do we get it to help us to think about things like business modeling? So segmentation is a great way of helping us to collect organize, and importantly, communicate a lot of complicated insights in a focused and purposeful way. As we say, in this particular case, we're focusing on the purposes of the business model canvas and what we need to know about that. It's also a way of taking a whole organization with you, taking your colleagues with you. Gives you a language with which you can actually talk to everybody quickly without going, you know, all those insights that all fit together when, you know, it's to do with that they like playing this price and they live in this place and they think this, but they don't mostly like doing that. You haven't got to keep saying that, you've got a name. So what is segmentation? Just to say it again in a different way, grouping your audiences and customers by similar needs, wants, or demand characteristics. It recognises that everyone is not the same and helps you manage that challenge. It makes a lot of commercial sense, but you can of course also use segmentation for a social sense. And I think some of the best organisational segmentations actually have you bake in your social purpose alongside your commercial purpose in the way that you do your segmentation. You recognise those things side by side. Okay, so, oh, that's backwards and forwards. So here's a really important 4 little useful bullets to remember. So meaningful segmentation is appropriate to scale and task. So I quite often say, if you're a very large organization, you can afford to have a very complex segmentation. But if you are a tiny gallery with a staff of 1 person and 1 volunteer, you don't need a very complicated segmentation because you're not going to be able to do lots of different things with lots of different people. So I would say, I always think of my local gallery, definitely their segmentation is people on our mailing list, people not on our mailing list. And that's kind of quite nice and simple. And that's about all they can actually respond to or do anything with. And of course, that works rather brilliantly with business model canvas as well as it happens. But once you're in the business of segmenting in the way that is both appropriate to scale and task, segment needs to be 4 things. Now just hold on to this idea because it's actually, this is the super important one. They need to be distinctive. So people in that group need to have enough in common that you can actually talk to them as a whole group. So they need to be homogenous, but they need to be different from other groups. So you can actually tell the difference between what message you're giving to these people over here, please join my mailing list, and what message you're giving to these people over here, please come to my private view. So really they need to be distinctive, and you need to know how their needs differ and how you can talk to them. The next thing is you actually need to know, you need to be able to contact them in some way. You need to be able to put something through to email them. You need to be able to put advertising out in front of them and so on. They have to be locatable, otherwise there is no use. They need to be of significant size. Obviously, we are all, in fact, the world is made up of segments of 1. The point is, can you group people in such a way that makes sense, both that they've got enough characteristics and size, but they are worth your energy and resource in terms of actually targeting them. And finally, the most important one that we often forget is they need to be relevant to your goals. So if you can't, we could group everybody by their hair color and it would be statistically meaningful. It would be truthful. They would be distinctive. They would be locatable, and you might have a significant size to try and sell them some opera, but are they relevant to what you do? So you need to segment by people that do or don't like opera, not by their hair color, just to keep it pretty simple, right? So those 4 rules I think are really, really helpful as you're setting off. You know, so you can do segmentation in a fairly simple throwaway kind of way, or you can do it in a very dense work of years with lots and lots of data setting behind it, but these rules always apply to it. So, so that's segmentation. So 4 kinds of data we tend to think of as ways of helping us to carve out those distinctive groupings. We often think about segmentation based on geography, where people live or where they operate. You can think of that geography in a broader sense. Demographics, including their socioeconomic background, which of course is very important when you're thinking about monetization. Behavioral segmentation, what do people do? How frequently do they do it? And the attitudinal things. Why do they do it? Why do they love some things over others? And the best kinds of segmentation usually are a combination. It may be that if you're thinking about a purely digital offer, for example, geography isn't very relevant to that. It may be if you're thinking about more straightforward things to do with behaviour, attitudes aren't particularly relevant to that or not, and so on. So again, all about judicious judgment. You could have judicious judgment. But anyway, a combination of those things are what you're going to be drawing on. So it just helps to frame, you know, thinking about all the things that you could be using. So getting started with segmentation. So here are some top tips really, rather than things from exercise books. So firstly, I think, as we've just been saying, it really works. You can start a segmentation just on a completely hypothetical basis. You might not have very much information at your fingertips. You might just have some anecdotes of some people that your front of house team told you that people keep on coming in and saying, my goodness, haven't you seen that fantastic restaurant down the road? It's a shame you haven't got one, or something. So you could be, you know, you could, out of that, you could formulate a theoretical, hypothetical segment called restaurant goers who like my gallery. So the idea that you can start with quite hypothetical ideas about who your segments be, and then backfill that, go and find the data, go and validate that, find out if it's true. So this can be a really useful way of starting, particularly if you're doing an early business model canvas idea, just throwing those ideas around and thinking about dividing people up based on what you already know, what you think you already know, and some of it might be hypothetical, is a really good way to start. Think about those different dimensions of the segmentation. What is most relevant to you? What information do you really need to know? Does where people live make any difference to you? If not, chuck it out. Does their age, people always get really obsessed with age groups. Does age actually matter in the thing you're doing? It might do, it might be very important indeed, but it might not, in which case, chuck it out and forget all about it. Then think about gathering evidence from the data sources available to you. You might not have a huge research budget, but as we've just been saying, there are clever ways around it if you think about it carefully. Make sure that when you're thinking about carrying out any kind of primary research, think about the real gaps. Think about what you really, really don't know, but really, really have to know. And that's when you think about primary research, to fill that gap. As we said, if you're working on business model canvas, don't worry about all sorts of extraneous information that won't help you to fill those boxes. Focus in on the things you need to know about. And then finally, we've got a new idea for you that we're still playing with. Think about mapping your questions and potential data sources onto your business model canvas. Now, that's what we've been thinking. We're working on a model at the moment that we think is going to be quite useful, and it looks a bit like this. So I'm not sure we've got the greatest examples here because we were doing this at high speed, but if you take your right-hand side of the business model canvas, you can map some of these things onto it. You could, for example, say, okay, so about our customer segments, what we need to know are, what are the different digital behaviors and attitudes of our recent streaming audience? So now you're just using this example of an organization that's been doing free digital streaming and now wants to think about trying to develop a paid for model. So these might be a kind of question you ask. And it's like, well, how are we going to get the answer to that? Well, we could just look at the feedback forms that we got from our recent digital season events, or we could just look at the emails that people sent us. We got loads of stuff. We could just trawl through all of that. That's a good start, right, to help you start to do some segmentation. So this idea of mapping your questions and the potential data sources you have onto the map. I think we've got some other things here as well. Aha, and then we just remember our Arts Council has just commissioned a great big report about digital audiences. I know that's going to tell us lots of things about things like their age group and that kind of thing, and what they really like and what they don't like if we're lucky. Yet we could use a bit of that as well. So it's a secondary data source. Oh yes, and we could look at our booking data. Some people actually use our booking system to do that. We can go and have a look at the booking data available to us. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but here are some examples of how you could answer that question. So mapping those kinds of, what are the killer questions, as Lauren observed. It's hard knowing what the right ones are, but if you're thinking about it from this point of view, it gets a bit easier. And then mapping those bits of information where you're going to try and find things out. So very much an iterative process, coming back to this when you know more, right? Oh, how do we find out about our viewers? Where do viewers find out about and buy content? So that might be the killer question there around channels. And then again, the idea that you can go and get some secondary data. We could look at our social and web stats to find out and so on. So segmentation list. Have you got the evidence? Do you know enough about your segment? You can layer up over time. You can you can learn about people as you go on. But if you were doing a business model canvassing exercise, you could, as you say, there's a little bit of toing and froing, iterating backwards and forth across the canvas and building up as you go. Have you grouped your people relevant to your proposition? Are there enough people? Are they reachable? Can you find the right channels and communication routes for them? Because if you can't, then you might as well chuck them out. Do they share enough characteristics? Can you target within the same message? And finally, and importantly, can you bring them alive? Now, we're very keen on this idea of working with personas to try and take all that data and to turn it into something that you can communicate easily with and sort of embodies some of the most important insights. I am not going to go through our entire persona building kit because it is sort of, it's kind of obliquely relevant to this conversation, but quite useful. I'm going to show it to you because you might like to have a go at using it. So transforming segments into personas, this means kind of giving a name and creating a sort of a figurehead representative character who says a lot about a single segment, essentially. So it's a portrait of a user and it represents that different audience or participant types. It represents that segment. Helps you to differentiate those needs. It's a meaningful frame for your data and it brings the data alive, essentially. And here's a way of doing it. So have a go at doing our persona canvas. The idea really here is to imagine a real person who represents that segment, give them a name, imagine a life for them, try and create a kind of person that's just, always leaping out from the data, what you know about your segment, and turn them into a real person. Here we go. Here's one that we did earlier called Caroline. Her heart was broke by Pete, etc., etc. Real person, really important to try and breathe some life into them. But next stage, step 2, we now want to really think about how they might relate to your proposition. So it's important they're a flesh and blood person that you can believe in, but of course you want to get quickly to how do they relate to your possible idea, the thing that you're coming up. What pains in their life can you actually solve, and what gains can you offer? So Caroline, for example, might always be late. Is there some way that we can help her to think about last minute booking, for example? Is there a different way of making sure that our channels work for somebody who's always is very time squeezed? As I said, the important thing about any kind of persona is make sure that the things that you've dreamt up about somewhere, you've already done this, go back and check your assumptions. This is an iterative model. Do go back and validate. If there are things that you felt you didn't really know about them, go back and fill in the gaps. Again, going back to all of our data sources. So some useful things about how you can actually use personas as part of your segmentation process. But as I say, it really, really helps with the imagination, the inspiration that comes from working with segments. Sophia. Value propositions.
Value proposition. So now we assume you understand your customers and your users, who they are, what they want, what groups they fall into. What is the next step with the business model canvas? The next step is the really important bit, the central bit of the business model canvas, is the value proposition. So you've got these customers. What are you going to offer them that they value? Now, the key bit is what they value, what they need, what problem you can solve for them. Remember, we talked about that idea of being user-centered rather than centered on your own organization. So here to illustrate, next slide. This is, everyone wants the value proposition to be something along the lines of, what I really need in my life is cutting-edge contemporary dance created by an incredibly cool artistic director. Now, there are people who will say this sort of thing. They are your biggest fans. You can get a lot out of them. I would say that sort of thing. But the number of people that actually that is the main need in their life is probably, I don't have evidence for this, I'm just saying it, probably pretty small. This is what the artistic director wants the value proposition to be. But you have to make sure that when you are designing a value proposition, that you are not designing what you wish the audience wanted. It's easy to get stuck into that trap. So this is what you wish the audience wanted, what you wish they valued, and some of them do. Next slide.
By the way, I have got some evidence that is a very small number of people. We've even got a name for them. So yeah, I guess that's...
There you go. There you go. But what might they really want? Anne, will you reveal?
What might they really want? I've revealed it. It just might be taking a while.
There we go. We've got it. So it might be all sorts of things. They might say, I want to take my kids to something that they will enjoy as much as I loved the Nutcracker when I was a kid. They might want to dress up and feel fancy for an evening and wear high heels for the first time since before COVID. They might want to show off when they go to work and say, oh, what did you do this weekend? I went to the opera and it was fantastic, and have everyone think how cultured they are. They might want something that takes them away from the worries of their life. They might want a place to meet up with friends. One gallery I worked with in Wales happened to be next door to the bus station, and they knew that a lot of people came into the gallery because they had a public toilet. And so the need that they filled in people's lives was an accessible, clean, friendly public toilet. Now, that might not be what you would want, but you know that there's something there, and you might be able to offer them something related. Maybe not in the toilet example, but usually there's something. So think about what your users or your customers really need. Now, these are all audience examples. It might not be an audience. You might get money from your city or town council, and they might say, we need to make our main street look more alive. We need to engage people from a deprived community and give them something worthwhile to do and help them gain skills. That's also an example of a need and a value proposition that you could fill for a government, or a funder might say, we need to engage children in the arts. That's also a need. Next slide. So when you're thinking about the value proposition, you're asking yourself, what can we offer that fills a need or solves a problem? You might say, in the case of your town council that wants to bring their high street or their main street alive, you might say, we solve your problem by creating a festival that will bring people to the high street. It will get news coverage. It will increase footfall and send people to shops. That's a value proposition for your outdoor festival. You also want to think about what differentiates you from your competitors or other people that fill the same need. This is like, what value do you bring that the theater down the street doesn't bring? That helps you refine your value proposition by thinking, how am I different from other people? You also want to think, when you're saying, here's the value, what is the shape of the thing that you're offering people to fill that hole? What features do people value most? So in the case of a theater, you say, well, I'm selling tickets. The product is a ticket and a seat in a theater. But you might say, to the person who wants to dress up and feel fancy, the product might be the ticket plus 2 glasses of champagne plus a scarf with your logo on it, for example. And something like that, they might value more than it costs you to produce it, because it helps them feel more fancy and like it's more a special occasion, for example. So the product might not be what you originally think, but it might vary based on the value that it can create. And finally, knowing what the value proposition is for your users helps you think about how you might want to talk about what you offer. So if you know that people come to your event for a fun night out, not for a serious engagement with culture, then your marketing talks about a fun night out or whatever it might be. So those are some aspects of kind of how you shape the value proposition and how you might think about it. Next slide. I think
that's really classic for marketers. That's about talking about the benefits, not the features, isn't it? The sizzle, not the sausage. Although I believe in States people say that it's the sizzle, not the hamburger, which throws me completely. But there you go. That kind of that idea that actually value may not be the object, I think is an enormously important idea, isn't it? And I think that takes us on to how to get the right kind of data, because actually, again, this is a very long chapter, and we're not going to do a very long chapter at this stage, but it's just about saying that actually, this is quite qualitative. Your understanding of value is quite a qualitative kind of understanding. So whether you get that through, you can get it through some quantitative measures, of course, but actually this is a lot about understanding attitudinal things, and people's feelings, the underlying things, if you like, not exclusively, but very often. So primary research and feedback are very important to determine perceptions of value. As we said, go wide here, think about not just what people are, because particularly if it's a new market, obviously you need to think about what else they do elsewhere. And I think that's not, don't imagine that the competition is only about other people that do exactly the same sort of things that you do. Often competition is about competition for time, competition for attention, competition for kind of positioning, if you like, being seen to be doing the right things, and how those things sort of change. And so this is where it becomes really interesting to understand what's going on in people's wider lives. So those kinds of persona exercises where you really get under the skin, I think, are very helpful to understanding what real value looks like and how different that is for different sets of people.
And think about how your competition is shaped by the needs of your users. So if the need is a fun night out, then you might think, well, actually our competition is nightclubs and cinemas. Whereas if the competition is someplace to get dressed up and go out, then your competition is fine restaurants, perhaps. There's a kind of a bigger picture.
And it kind of sounds obvious when we say it like that, doesn't it? But I mean, I was working with a theatre director a little while ago who was very, very keen to find a much younger audience, and actually was kind of saying, I'm going to do anything it takes, anything it takes. And then when we said, well, actually, let's look at what all the young people in this particular town do. And then we discovered it was a pretty cheesy nightclub that he wouldn't have been seen dead in himself. And so, well, so really, let's look at what, you know, so, but I still have to, I still have to do plays, and I have to do plays like this because that's what I believe in. It's like, well, that therein lies the interesting, you know, can you actually develop something new in the business model canvas, because it will definitely require doing something in a different space, because, you know, those kind of questions, I think they are really, it sort of sounds obvious, but actually I think this is an important challenge that we have at our fingertips, really, isn't it? How willing are we, how, you know, are we willing to do the things that are the propositions that people really regard as having value? Right, so I've lost my cursor. Yes, one really important point, I think, just at the end of this is this notion that prototyping can be very helpful when we want to talk to people about their attitudes and their feelings about things. So sometimes people aren't always aware of what they attribute value to and how they feel about something. And I think this idea that, in fact, you might say, when I talk about a prototype, I don't mean to say you have to do a sort of necessarily, although it is quite useful, you don't necessarily have to do a sort of a scratch performance of something, or a mini exhibition, or indeed to put on a whole new digital program. But you could just do a mock-up of what a brochure might look like, or you could send out you know, sort of an A/B test, send some people you know, that might be interested in one treatment of, you know, one version of champagne and roses plus your seat, and another one you know, is just all about late booking and discounts, and then just see what kind of responses you get back. And that can be a much more effective way, sending out prototypes, making mock-ups, and getting people to respond to you and tell you what they think about those things actually is in a way much easier than asking people for their direct feelings about things. This also holds true, I think, for next. So where are we? I think we're just about to go on to. So if we were thinking about mapping those kinds of things on, we've already worked out, we're talking to Caroline or not, or Caroline and various other people. If we then think in the value proposition box, the kind of questions we might ask is, why would people recommend us to their friends? You know, what kind of benefits, what kind of value would they be talking about to somebody else, for example? What social impact does this actually generate? What's, you know, what kind of, you know, how's this going to make somebody feel about themselves? And where might we get the kind of data, feedback from users, for example? Obviously, we might want to do some semantic analysis of what people were saying to their friends on, you know, on social. We might want to e-survey our regular audiences and ask them some, you know, pointed questions about it. And as I said, we might also want to A/B test different kinds of promotional materials, or giving people different kinds of offers just to get a bit of a flavour. We might also, I don't know if you want to just talk about this again, you mentioned, Sophia, that you know, we may also be thinking about other kinds of relationships at the same time, although you know, even around a particular offer, you know, this idea that actually, does the funder require so much reporting, the grant isn't worth the trouble? Do we just discount the idea of that particular kind of revenue? Did you want to, yeah, I think we've already spoken to that. So moving on now to the final part we were going to have a little think about, revenue streams.
Right, so assuming you understand your customer segments now, you know what they need, you've created, you know what they value, you've created something that you think they might value, and now you get to find out whether they do value it or not. So how are you going to generate money out of this? This is the next box in the business model canvas. The first thing to ask, you might think it's pricing. Many people would start with pricing, and you start with pricing if you know what you're offering. But the first kind of question to ask is, what is the model? Are you, you know, with a digital offer, let's say we've got our digital streaming offer. Are you selling people the video as a download? Are you letting them rent the video and watch it for 24 hours or a week, and then it disappears? Are you licensing it to a local broadcaster so they can show it on their television channel or to Netflix? Are you creating a subscription so that people can watch all they want of your digital streaming for a year? Are you asking for donations? So there's kind of a first question of like, what model are you using to generate revenue? And with digital especially, that's often quite complicated. So that's something you really want to think about. Then, of course, pricing. What is the willingness and ability of the customer to pay? And I've separated those out intentionally because a wealthy customer may not be willing to pay for something that they think isn't valuable, or for something that they see other people not paying for. So this is where market research comes in really handy. You want to see how much people are used to paying for something. You might ask them, you might look at competitors, you might find that everyone is used to getting everything for free on YouTube, or the payment that they're used to paying is watching some adverts on YouTube. So it's important to understand the context of what that affects people's willingness to pay. And if you find out that they are willing to pay, congratulations. But you want to think finally about kind of the market size, how many people you might find. And this relates to the size of the customer segment, obviously. But what percentage of those do you actually think will pay for this service? Therefore, will it generate enough revenue to balance out the costs, which you've thought about on the other side of the business model canvas? And I think Anne is going to introduce.
There's a day-long workshop on the revenue streams around different models, of course, and also on pricing. So just to think a little bit about some of the most relevant things. So obviously, there's something about having quantified your segments. If we're starting with that, do you actually know when you started off thinking about creating something for somebody, are there enough people that fit that model? And if we go back to our one man sitting in the auditorium who's very interested in that proposition, we like the sound of him, but actually, is there a model that's actually going to work for a very, very small segment? Possibly not. So there's a bit of iteration around that as well. I think there is an issue that the psychology of asking people about money is very difficult. So if you ask people very direct questions about what they're willing to pay for, how they're willing to pay for it, how they correspond price to value, you often don't get a very honest reaction. So this is where actually the use of data is particularly useful. So behavioral analysis is particularly important, but also, just looking at what people have actually done. There's a big difference between, this is one of the biggest disparities between what people say they do and what people say they want and what they actually do. We know that pricing and the paying for value is one of the most difficult things to get at. So if you have got data about that, that is probably the place to start. Definitely use your available data. I think the other thing to say is that, again, prototyping is a really useful way of doing it. Show people different pricing models and so on. Get them to react to talk about something you put in front of them, rather than saying, "Do you like paying a lot of money for something that only takes 5 minutes?" It's all about using a real tangible thing as a way of extracting information is very important. So finally, if we're going to then map on some of our thinking about revenue streams onto our questions, we might be asking questions like, if you think about that new digital offer in particular, we've got quite a lot of good data that's coming out of some of our COVID-related studies about the fact that we've got some really clear segments, I think, coming out of that about the different groups who are interested in digital streaming. For example, there's one group that's definitely much more interested in kind of mainstream product that looks a bit like a BBC public service broadcast version of a production. They're not that bothered about who's creating it. They want it to be a big, they're bothered about it as much as they want it to be a big brand. They'd rather go and watch, they don't really want to see their local theatre doing something. They'd rather their first chance to see the Royal Shakespeare Company or the Met doing something than necessarily staying local. They have a very different need to a kind of a sort of a niche market that's looking for the unusual. Suddenly they have a world of digital offer available. We're kind of really interested in the fact that each of them have a completely different potential business model around them. So how might you find out about it? Again, A/B testing, mock up those subscriptions, see how people respond to them, mock up an introductory offer. There are definitely these big studies at the moment, I think, are giving us lots of clues, or the COVID research, for example, is telling us a lot, but I think gives us inspiration. And you might go to things like our audience finder data set to sort of see how big a potential market has a particular interest in something actually is. So some of these kind of mutual data sets are very, very useful for giving us clues about some questions all across the whole map. So not much chance to explore that in any detail, but giving you an idea about plotting the questions and your potential data sources onto the business model canvas to make sure that what you have is an evidence-driven business model canvas rather than a kind of entirely made up one. Chances are you've got a greater chance of success. And that really, in a nutshell, is our presentation to you. Sophia, would you like to add any final words on that one before I do the closing bit?
I think that sums it up. It's a way basically of bringing two things into contact. One is all of these streams of research and data, and the other one is potentially a slightly more commercial outlook on what you're doing. Now, that may or may not be appropriate, but if you've got a project where you really want to balance the books and have your revenue cover your costs, or try that out and see how it works all as a big picture, the business model canvas is a really good tool to use, and one that we use with creative businesses as well as with cultural organizations.
Well, brilliant. I hope you all found that useful, despite the fact that, you know, the chat was a little bit slow there, guys. I know it's the end of the day. Well, it's not the end of our day. It's not the end of your day. You've still got some to go. So, but what we would love you to do, I believe they're going to drop a little note about, just get some feedback on that. Of course, we believe in greatly. Any comments and thoughts adding to sessions like this? We're really particularly interested to know in different formats across the whole conference what was useful and what we'd like to see more of. Do please give us your feedback. I believe, oh, Eric's got a question. He wants to ask something. Is there a minimum or maximum number of personas when creating behavioural segmentation? That's an interesting one. I think ideally you want one persona per segment would be my suggestion. And the minute you need it, is that what you were getting at, Eric?
I think that might be part of it. I'm wondering also whether it's a question of how many segments are useful. And the answer is kind of how many can you handle? I mean, 2 is a minimum. Otherwise, why would you create a segmentation? But if you've only got 2, that's fine. I would say more than, well, it really depends. I mean, with audience spectrum, we have, how many segments do we have, Anne? 10, which is a lot to manage if you're creating your own. For an individual organization, I would say 3 to 5, if you're a small organization, is more than enough. You want to be able to hold them in your head.
That's right. I was going to say, it's really worth bearing in mind that a segmentation is not a true representation of how the data falls out and how the data groups. So it's not, so a statistical cluster exercise is not a segmentation, if that makes sense. I'm talking to Eric here with his data head on in particular, you know. So statistical clustering is not segmentation. Statistical clustering may underpin a segmentation, but a segmentation is fundamentally a construct which allows you to think about organizing insights around your customers. Does that make sense? I think it's a really, really important distinction, because as I say, you know, that my little gallery that has its on my mailing list, not on my mailing list segmentation, that's probably, you know, you could cluster its audience by the color of its hair and many other things in lots of different ways. But what matters is the construct that is useful to that organization when it's trying to get something done. So I think that's it's a very good question for that very reason. So I was trying to wind up and be beautifully on time there, Eric, but I say, you know where we are. You do have I think on the last slide you've got Sophia's email, and you've definitely got mine. We are all over the conference. We're around. We're always contactable, and we would love to have more conversations with you. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, please get in touch, and if the question is more appropriate for Anne, if you send it to me, I will pass it on to her, but don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you.
And as it says, please do evaluate the conference. You should see that right now. Help us gather our data to serve you better in the future.
Exactly. There are more things happening next, Eric, are there not? Do go back to the to FanLab and to go and have a look at what's coming up next, and enjoy the rest of the day, folks. I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you all very, very much indeed, and thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Take care all. Have fun.